Cheers. Good morning. See my new mug from my homegirl Gretchen. She got the font right and everything. Good morning. I am Stephen Edholm from SkillCult.com, and I have a cool video for you today. This is going to be a pretty long one, actually. It's probably going to break up into 3 or 4 videos because there's just a lot of stuff to cover. So I have a list, and we're just going to go point by point and cover the whole thing. The purpose of this video being to put together in one place all of the things that go wrong with axes, both used and new. So this is going to be, not about design. It's more about what goes wrong in manufacture and execution of an axe, or what happens to a used axe in use and abuse. In short, what to look for in a new or used axe, or what to avoid. Now, this is also not going to be about getting an axe that's ready to work directly out of the box, because that's almost unheard of. I mean, it's very, very rare. You shouldn't expect that, and axes have not come that way traditionally ever. And the same goes for used axes. Like, most used axes have never been ground to chop well. There are some exceptions. You run into them once in a while, like this one, for instance, has definitely been ground actually pretty well. But since then, it's been used a lot and resharpened, and it's kind of blunt on the edge now. But that's the exception. Usually they're not ground at all. And you may have to do other work on a new axe too. I mean, there's very few situations where you're going to get an axe that you just pick up and start chopping. So at the end of this video, we'll tie the thing up with about kind of like what your options are and what you should do, or what you can consider, and weighing some of the options. Okay, first off, rust and pitting. Surface rust is not an issue at all. It's real easy to take off. You can wire brush it off or soak the thing in vinegar for a couple days. Deep pitting is usually not an issue either, unless it's very, very deep. Usually, again, most axes have never been ground right. So you take almost any of these axes and you're going to file so much off just getting the thing to cut, assuming you're using it to actually chop wood and, slice into wood and not just split wood. Then you're going to need to grind it anyway, and chances are most of those pock marks left from the pitting are going to be, filed or ground out. So that's just cosmetic. It's actually a good way to get a cheap axe. If you get an axe that's pitted, it's going to be cheaper. Speaking of grinding and filing, if you get a tool that's supposed to be single beveled, like this hewing hatchet here, it's supposed to be flat on this side and beveled on this side. And often someone will grind a secondary bevel on this side because they just don't know what they're doing, or think, what's this weird axe? It's supposed to have 2 bevels, and they do that, and then they screw it up. So let's say if you had this broad axe here, which is probably not going to be very cheap, and you get that and someone has ground, say, like a 3/16 inch bevel like this on this side. Well, that means in order to get this to function the way it's supposed to, you have to take off all that metal and bring the edge all the way back to where this is flat again. And that's, you're going to lose a lot, and it's a bunch of work. So when you look at a tool like that, really weigh, visualize what it's going to look like when you're finished and whether that's going to be acceptable. Another real common problem is that axes have been ground on a high-speed coarse grinder and overheated, which can ruin the temper. So I have to kind of explain how tools are hardened and the whole temper thing in order to explain that. So let's imagine a scale, and over here it's very soft, and over here is very hard. So you can make steel on, hard on this end or soft on this end, or anywhere in between. Now, the way that process works is you heat the steel to a red heat, and then you quench it in oil or salt brine usually. And you see this black line right here where it's dark down here and it's like light gray here. That's the quench line. So this was dipped in the quench up to this point. Now that makes this super hard and brittle over here. This part of the axe is soft because it was heated to red heat, but it wasn't quenched, and then it's just allowed to cool usually at a normal rate, and it's actually quite soft. Like, there's some teeth marks here from where someone clamped this in a vise. So if the edge was on this end, then we'd go to use this and the edge would literally just bend over on just normal wood, let alone if you hit a knot or a rock or something. If we left it super hard on this end, just quenched like that, then this could literally just break big chunks out of the edge because it's so brittle. Like, if it was that hard and I took this and just hit that, I could just bust off a big chunk. It's like glass. So what happens is you take that's now hard and you reheat it, and as it rises in temperature, it slowly moves this way on the spectrum, and then at some point you stop it and you say, this is where I want, this is the hardness I want. You quench that, and then it freezes it at that hardness. It's close enough to this end of the spectrum that it's not going to just chip and break big chunks out of the blade. and it's hard enough to hold an edge. So this is the compromise. You know, you find this place, and there's a range in there of useful hardnesses that you can get away with. But remember, we got to this place by starting here and heating it, right? So now this is what happens. Someone takes an axe like this, which has coarse grind marks in it, and they lay into a grinding wheel and they're grinding it to shape, and then they get near the edge, it overheats, it gets too hot, and then whatever they're grinding that gets too hot starts moving this way on the spectrum towards the soft end, and it's pretty easy to go from here to here that fast. Just like, oops, overheated that. So then you end up with a soft spot on the edge. So that's not uncommon when someone uses a grinder on an axe. It may not be a deal killer, it's just, you just don't know what happened. It may be that just one small part of the very edge is soft, and then that will eventually be ground and filed out, and it's not a big deal. You just don't know those. So a telltale sign though is, for instance, on this axe, there's really coarse, big scratches. It's actually a little bit hollow, like you can see that it was done on a rounded wheel, and it's sloppy. So that means that someone didn't know what the hell they were doing. They just laid into a coarse grinder with this thing, went all the way up to the edge, and who knows what happened. It's just an unknown. But when you're buying a used axe, that's something that you want to take a look at. And if you see these coarse grind marks, there's a good chance that that edge was overheated at some point. Again, it may or may not be a deal killer, but you just don't know that. So another thing to look for in that is, of the two axes I have here that have obvious, obvious lure sharpen on a grinder, both of them have wonky edges this way, like they undulate this way, because someone is using this really high-speed grinder, and it's just really easy if you're grinding right up to the edge, which is really bad. Like, the chances that someone did not overheat this edge are actually pretty slim, I would say. So it's easy to make the edge really uneven. Now, if you're filing or grinding by hand, it's a little bit harder to do that. And so both of these, the only axes here that are really obviously sharpened on a grinder, both of them have this, kind of wavy edge this way. The other way an axe can get softened like that is just going through a fire. So maybe there was a shop fire and the thing got burned up. Also, people will sometimes burn the handle out of the eye because they don't have any way to drill it out, or they don't know how, or something. Now, some people say never ever do that, and some people say it's okay as long as you bury the bit in damp soil. It's something I'd like to test and just figure out what the truth is about that. And it can be very difficult to get a handle out in the field if you don't have a drill and all that stuff, or even impossible. Very difficult sometimes. So someone that's used to filing axes can get some feel for how hard the steel is. At least they can tell if it's way on this end of the spectrum or way on this end of the spectrum. But as a field test, that's only so useful. Like if you're at the flea market and you take a file, if they'll let you start really filing on it and you can figure out a way to hold the thing, you can get some information from filing it if you know what you're doing. But of course, then you don't really need me to tell you that. But it is possible. Like I had an axe once that had both a hard spot and a soft spot in the same edge. It was a pretty long edge. I think it was a Hudson Bay axe. And so I would start filing, and it'd file normally, like grip normally, and then it would skid over this glassy hard spot, and then it would file normal again, and then it would dig in at this really soft spot, and then it would file normal again till the end. I was able to use that axe, but it did chip numerous times. I had chips on the hard spot, and it just was kind of weird. So obviously that's not preferable if you can avoid it. Again, this is one of the things that you just may not be able to tell about a used axe. Obviously, you may have chips in the edge of a used axe, so you want to look for that. But if it's not actually cracked, if it's just small chips or little dents and nicks and stuff, that's usually not that big of a deal. If it's big enough that to actually affect chopping significantly, then I'm going to do something about it. But typically, you don't have to, and I'll just start, I just keep sharpening the axe, and pretty soon they're gone. So small chips are not a big deal, but here's a real common problem that is a big deal, or can be, is you see this axe head someone sent me, and how it goes like this, and then this part, which is usually out here, drops way back and it curves down. Well, that's because people tend to hit this in the dirt a lot. This is the part of an axe that usually gets dull the most, is this toe right here. And then someone grinds it back, but they don't grind the rest of the axe to keep up with it as it goes back like this, so you end up with this sweep off. Sometimes it's both edges here, and it just ends up like a really strong curve. Typically, you want to avoid those. This is an axe someone sent me that I'm going to modify. So in order to get rid of this back sweep here, I'm going to bring this down about 3/8 to 1/2 of an inch. I want this to be a little lighter anyway. And then also I'm going to take more out here and remove some from this corner, tapering up into this, because I want this corner to lead this corner slightly. If anything, they should either be even, or this one should be back a little bit to, you know, make the hang right. So something to remember about bringing an axe back like that, like grinding some of the edge off and bringing it this way, is that just because the axe was quenched up to this line and hardened up to this line doesn't mean that it's the same hardness all the way from this point to the edge. It may actually be harder on the edge and then slowly be getting softer and softer towards the back. So by the time you get back here, there's no guarantee that the hardness here is going to be the same as the original hardness of the edge. Again, something to keep in mind, you're not going to know until you get in there and then start using the thing and see if it holds up or not. But you will commonly see axes like this that used to be, you know, at least a ½ inch longer. This is probably a 4+ pound axe, and it's been, you know, just worn back from use and grinding all the way back to here. Two other problems you can see on the edge of an axe are cracks and delamination. So cracks can happen for all kinds of reasons. They can happen in manufacture, they sometimes occur in new axes, or they occur during normal, you know, what should be normal use, not abuse, because there's a stress in the metal that's there just kind of waiting to happen. Or there's a hard spot. It could be because the axe hit a rock or a really hard knot. Could be because that particular axe is just on the hard, you know, it's on the hard end of the spectrum, therefore it's more brittle and more likely to crack. It could be because the axe was super cold and the steel is, you know, harder and more brittle if it's super cold. Cracks are really hard to spot, and especially in a picture or something like that, or an old rusty axe. Once you start filing it and you get the whole edge filed, then usually that's when they show up and you see them. Sometimes they're more obvious, but not always. It doesn't mean that you can't use an axe, but it's certainly not something I would, you know, I wouldn't buy an axe with that problem. Delamination happens when there's a weld in the axe that usually it's the edge, so it's where this axe, for instance, is laminated. So this is like a softer metal, like iron or mild steel, and then the edge right here is a hard piece of metal that was forge welded in. So both pieces are gotten super hot, almost melting, and then slammed together really quickly, and they actually kind of like weld and glue together. It's called forge welding. That axe is welded, this axe is welded. Most axes that you get will not be welded. It's a little bit more of an archaic process, so modern axes are almost never welded. When they are, you can start to get a delamination at that point. Like I had a double bit recently that I sold on eBay, and it had, you know, double welds on each end, and both of them were starting to delaminate a little bit. Like the weld just wasn't clean, like it didn't take all the way. I didn't see that at all until I soaked it in vinegar, and then I took it out and it was really obvious. So again, that's going to be something that you might not be able to spot. Alright, so let's talk about poles now. So it's almost uncommon to get a used axe with no damage to the pole. What happens is this gets pounded on and it starts to mushroom. I don't know if you can see, but there's a little, you know, lip here where the metal starts to squish outward. Sometimes it's just a little bit, sometimes it's really bad, but the norm is to have at least some mushrooming. What happens is people are using their axe to split wood. You know, you stick it in the stump, and if it doesn't split the wood, then you take a sledgehammer or split the back of a splitting wall and you pound it through the wood. That, you know, can work okay, but you're basically just using your axe as a wedge, and it always incurs some damage here eventually. Usually that's not a big deal, and you could file it off. I could file off, with the right file, I could file both of these off in about 1 minute each. Not a big deal. Is if it's so severe that you're removing a large amount of metal, it could affect the mass of the back. This one was especially bad. It was mushroomed over a huge amount, and just, you know, it's shorter, you know, a ½ inch down I removed metal. So that means that the mass of the pole is not the same as it was intended to be originally. Also, this is the only axe I have, this is fairly uncommon, but it does happen, where it looks like the eye is slightly distended and warped from all this pressure, right? Hitting it over and over again. Eventually the eye can start to change shape, and warp and move around. So that can happen. If you see really severe damage up here, you know, it's not the axe that you'd want to buy first for sure. Again, usually it's not a deal killer. This one has it, this one has it, this one has it. I'll talk about this one in a second and why it doesn't have it. This one has it, this one has it, this one had it, this one had it, that one had it. Literally this one had it, every used single pole axe here, except maybe these hewing tools, was mushroomed to some extent. Now, very rarely you'll find an axe that actually is hardened. Remember we looked at the hardening line on this? Well, look, here's another hardening or quenching line right here. So this was actually quenched, which is uncommon, but it does happen. So that this could be used, the back of this could be used for pounding. Instead, someone used it the same way I was talking about, like they always do, and beat on this with like a sledgehammer or something. So instead of being mushroomed, which it's not at all, it's cracked. You know, there's 1, 2, 3 cracks on this side, one here, all kinds of micro cracks on the face. This wasn't made for that use, and eventually what'll happen is it'll start to chip. If people kept doing that, it'd lose chips off of the edge and it would start to disintegrate instead of mushrooming. Is that better? Well, who knows. Just don't misuse your axe that way. This is made so that this can be used as a hammer occasionally, not to be beaten on senselessly. I didn't see those cracks at all, and I didn't know the pole was hard until I soaked that thing in vinegar, and then it cleaned everything off and it became very obvious. Now the average pole, especially on a new axe, is crooked. It doesn't really matter who you buy it from, or, you know, they're almost always crooked. They're often very crooked. Not a big deal. You know, up to 5 minutes with a file, a good file, and you should be able to get the thing back into shape. Like, see, this one is high on this corner and it's a little bit like warped this way. So you just want to file that off to get it nice and flat. And the last type of damage you'll see to axes, usually pounding up here, where someone actually pounded on the top of the axe head with a hammer or something, trying to pound it onto a handle, which is not how you you should put an axe head on a handle. You should put the handle in and then hit the back end of the handle like this, and it just jumps the head on by inertia, and you don't have to hit it with anything. It's usually not a big deal. So with this one I could do about, you know, a couple minutes of filing here to clean that up, and then it's going to take me a little while with like a half round file or something to get in here, or maybe a chainsaw file, and take this lip off, because the metal has been bashed and bent and curled into the inside of the eye, and that has to be gotten rid of so this is smooth. So usually that's not a big deal unless it's extremely severe. Okay, so that covers all the kinds of damage that can happen from use and abuse, and next we're going to move on to symmetry and alignment.